Locard's exchange principle. Traces of physical materials, no matter how minute, can tell a story. Trace evidence is factual. Unlike humans, it cannot be confused by the excitement of the moment, and it does not forget. It's a silent witness that speaks when humans cannot. Physical evidence cannot be wrong, it cannot lie, it cannot be wholly absent. Only human failure to find it, study and understand it, can diminish its value. Dr. Edmund Locard. My presentation is on reporting sexual abuse in shelter animals. The example case in this presentation was inspired by an actual case I'd seen in practice. As a veterinary student, I had no training in identifying or collecting evidence in sexual abuse cases, so when I was faced with my first patient that I suspected had been sexually abused, I was uncertain how to collect samples for processing or which tests to conduct. This presentation is designed to provide you with resources, an example of how to manage a sexual abuse case. My case involved a goat that was found on the side of the highway by a Good Samaritan. The goat was picked up in the field by an animal welfare officer and taken to the local animal shelter. Although there are instances where animals are collected from a residence and evidence can be collected from a potential crime scene, that was not possible for the goat. In my experience, the veterinarian is not called to the crime scene, but there's an officer available to answer questions about where the animal was found and the conditions of the environment. The forms I used throughout my report I found for free on veterinaryforensics.com. There are a variety of different reports and logs available on the website needed for both live animals as well as necropsies. In addition, the book Veterinary Forensics: Animal Cruelty Investigations by Dr. Melinda Merck is an invaluable resource. The first form is the live animal intake form, providing information on where the animal was found and the circumstances surrounding the animal. It's an opportunity to provide information about the location, such as the general conditions, the availability of water and food, whether or not the animal was indoors or outdoors, and the animal's demeanor at the scene. This is information that may need to be provided by the animal welfare officer. It's important to provide as much information about the animal at the scene as possible, as the demeanor of the animal in a shelter setting may be considerably different. A complete physical exam should be performed, including a fundic and otic examination and examination of the vaginal vault in females, which may require sedation. In cases of potential sexual abuse, there may be loss of fur or feathers, or tearing, bruising, or swelling around orifices. Any animal with trauma to the anus, nipples, and genitalia warrants a thorough examination for sexual abuse. Sometimes the animals suffer asphyxiation, so a thorough fundic examination, an examination for anterior uveitis should be performed, and the neck should be checked for bruising. The ears and ear canals can sometimes show evidence of trauma from restraint as well. The animal's response to vaginoscopy or examination of the genitalia can indicate evidence of sexual abuse if it's not what you would typically expect. The limbs should be examined for evidence of trauma or dermatitis associated with ligatures. If radiographs are performed, there may even be evidence of periosteal inflammation from ligatures, which may prove the abuse has been chronic. The anal glands should be checked for irritation. Photographic evidence should be provided that includes both photos to identify the animals, including a view from the front, the back, the left and right side, and a dorsal view. At least the first photo in the series should contain identification that includes the date, the agency performing the exam or necropsy, the case number, and the animal's ID number. The Veterinary Forensic website has a photo log to keep track of photographs. Make sure to begin taking photos on a blank or formatted SD card. You'll want to use a dedicated camera because if you use your cell phone to take photographs, you can have your phone confiscated as evidence. Once you take a photo, it should not be deleted. You can only include the photos you need in your report, but you must keep all the photos you've taken as evidence. When photographing evidence, begin by taking photographs from far away and then zoom in so there will be photos for reference. If possible, baseline blood work is recommended and a fecal should be performed. If the animal has internal parasites, it can provide another explanation for colitis or rectal irritation. Full body radiographs may be useful to assess the animal for other evidence of trauma and should include where the radiographs were taken, animal ID information, and the date permanently embedded in the image. In females, if a urine sample can be collected, it may contain sperm if semen was retropulsed into the bladder. Swabs can be taken from the mouth, and the results of microbial testing can be linked to wounds on an assailant. Separate swabs should be taken of the vagina and rectum prior to any testing, including a rectal temperature. Several swabs should be done to test for human DNA and to check for sperm to increase the chance of detection. Samples which may contain sperm should not be centrifuged, since sperm is fragile and may be destroyed by centrifuging. Sterile saline can also be used to perform a vaginal flush using a syringe and a red rubber catheter. The saline is infused, aspirated, then infused again and aspirated to collect a sample. Although the sperm tails degrade quickly, sperm heads can remain intact for 48 to 72 hours. Semen also contains a protein referred to as P30 that indicates recent exposure to human sperm. If a condom was used, lubricant can be identified from samples and can potentially even indicate the brand of condom used. Make sure not to use powdered gloves when collecting evidence, as the powder can interfere with the ability to identify the lubricant. The animal should be examined using a Woods lamp to check for possible ejaculate. If suspicious material is seen, hair samples can be clipped and collected. Use caution when collecting samples, since any sample containing human DNA could also potentially harbor infectious diseases. Also bear in mind, human labs will need to be used to identify human DNA and to wear gloves and change them frequently to avoid contaminating any samples. If you need to include an item as a reference for size, make sure you photograph the item straight on and not at an angle. You can use standard items like a quarter or a scalpel blade with a ruler. Ideally, if you can get an ABFO number 2, it includes measurements as well as correction for color and positioning. In the case of the goat, the only evidence of abuse found on physical exam was trauma to the vulva. The goat was examined 24 hours after being picked up by an animal welfare officer, so a urine sample would no longer be useful. The goat was checked with a Woods lamp and there was no fluorescence. Swabs were taken of the vulva and vaginal vault, and a wet prep was performed, but at 24 hours a wet prep would no longer be useful. Samples were preserved but not tested, since the previous potential owner of the goat was never determined. Although it is possible to get human sexual assault evidence kits, it's also possible to put together the contents of a sexual assault kit on your own. Typically, the kit includes bags and a white sheet for collecting evidence, swabs, supplies for collecting blood, slides, a comb, paper envelopes for evidence, a nail pick, and gloves. Change gloves frequently as needed, but particularly between collecting evidence and packaging. Swabs should only come into contact with one area and should be air-dried before placing in an envelope. One benefit of having an actual sexual assault evidence kit is the evidence that's collected may appear more professional. All items should be packaged in paper and not plastic, and if the envelope has a seal, it should be sealed with water rather than saliva. Samples may grow fungus if stored in plastic bags, and DNA can degrade. If you don't have access to evidence envelopes, you can create an envelope for evidence using a pharmacy or druggist fold. There's an instructional YouTube video entitled Unit 4.3 Druggist Fold, as well as instructional images. The image is sealed with a piece of tape, and you place your signature and date across the tape. There's evidence tape available that must be torn and cannot be peeled away. This is the beginning of the chain of custody and should be documented. There is a chain of custody log available at veterinaryforensics.com. A common question in cases of animal abuse is whether or not the animal has been harmed. Even if there's no evidence of physical abuse, if the animal has a change in behavior, it's a sign of abuse. This can either be fearful behavior, lack of normal grooming behavior, abnormal social interactions, or inappropriate behavior such as sexually receptive behavior with human contact. Animals can also be assessed using standardized pain scales, such as the pain scales developed by Colorado State University. Animal cruelty laws vary by state, and state cruelty laws may require evidence of injury or suffering. These cases are inherently stressful, and one of the best ways to reduce the stress of the case is to be prepared in advance.